You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
I think that balance is quite difficult, honestly, and this is something that we are hoping to achieve through our report, because we feel that there's a misbalance in trying to just use and the misuse. So something that we want the governments is to understand how the misuse is harmful for them as well as the entire world, and obviously the industry that's been perpetuating because of the misuse is harmful to human rights and the national security, not just of their government, but otherwise.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, N2K Cyberwire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hey there, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, Ben discusses new election-related deepfake laws coming out of California. I look at an FTC report on social media platforms. And later in the show, Jen Roberts, Assistant Director for Cyber Statecraft Initiative, and Natansha Basal, Assistant Director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, both from the Atlantic Council, are here to share their report, Mythical Beasts and Where to Find Them, mapping the global spyware market and its threat to national security and human rights. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. Hey everybody, Dave here. Have you ever wondered where your personal information is lurking online? Like many of you, I was concerned about my data being sold by data brokers. So I decided to try Delete Me. I have to say, Delete Me is a game changer. Within days of signing up, they started removing my personal information from hundreds of data brokers. I finally have peace of mind knowing my data privacy is protected. Delete Me's team does all the work for you with detailed reports, so you know exactly what's been done. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and use promo code N2K at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and enter code N2K at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/N2K, code N2K. All right, Ben, we got some interesting things to talk about this week. You want to start things off for us?
Yeah, so I go back to my native state of California, not just because I have a bias towards California stories, but a lot of laws related to technology and big tech companies come out of California because that's where the big tech companies are located and they have a very progressive legislature.
Right.
So today we're talking about a package of laws that were recently signed by Governor Gavin Newsom relating to deepfakes, specifically deepfakes in and around an election, whether that is a state or federal election. So there's a package of 3 laws. One of them takes effect immediately. That law effectively bans people or groups from knowingly sharing certain deceptive election-related deepfakes. It is enforceable 120 days prior to an election, so about 4 months. But then it does something that's not done in any similar state laws. It makes it enforceable 60 days after the election. I think if you look back to 2020, you might understand why we would want to avoid misinformation in the period immediately following an election.
Okay, sure.
So I think that instinctively makes sense.
Yeah.
Second part of the package goes into effect in January. It requires labels to appear on deceptive audio, video, or images in political advertisements when they are generated with the help of AI tools. I think this one, for the most part, we already see in a lot of political advertisements disclaimers saying that this was created using artificial intelligence. I've seen official ads from campaigns that make use of AI and have pretty substantial or pretty noticeable warnings, at least at some point in the audio and video.
I've yet to see that. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's relatively new, and it's probably in anticipation of this law and other state laws.
Right.
Finally, the third law, which also goes into effect in January, is called the Defending Democracy from Deepfake Deception Act, DDDD. They didn't go for the acronym here. They just went for the alliteration. This would require social media platforms and other websites with more than 1 million users, so all of the popular social media sites, to label or remove AI deepfakes within 72 hours after receiving a complaint. If the website does not take action, a court can require them to do so they can issue an injunction. So what's fascinating to me is you have a real battle of values here between trying to minimize election-related disinformation, including the creation of deepfakes that are becoming increasingly believable and increasingly convincing. One of my good friends just talked about how his mother-in-law was convinced to vote against one of the presidential candidates because she saw a deepfake video and was talking about it as if it were true, while it was in fact a deepfake.
Wow.
So it's that value. It's trying to minimize disinformation versus the very substantial free speech rights here. And I ultimately think when this is inevitably challenged in court, and there have already been lawsuits, that we might see these laws struck down under the First Amendment.
Huh.
So First Amendment is not absolute, even though it is the First Amendment listed in our Bill of Rights. And even though the beginning of the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law. Mm-hmm. And it is, of course, applicable to the states. But there are ways in which you can circumvent the First Amendment. Basically, if you have a content-based restriction on speech, so if there is a law that restricts speech based on its specific content, then the government can restrict that speech as long as it has a compelling interest and if the means are narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. So here, this to me is extremely clearly a content-based restriction. You're not preventing all types of election-related information. You're not limiting it to all subjects, or you don't even have like a broad category of subjects that are subject to this law, so to speak. It is very specific. It is about election-related deepfakes within that particular time period, 120 days before the election to 60 days after the election.
Okay.
That, to me, is definitely a content-based restriction on speech. So that means the government has to have a compelling state interest. Do they have a compelling state interest? I think they could argue that in court pretty convincingly. Protecting the public from misinformation, from deceiving voters, I think is certainly a compelling state interest. I think that's a case that they could make rather easily when this goes into court. Where I think this might fall is on the second prong of that test, which is, are the means here sufficiently narrowly tailored to that interest? Basically, the state will have to convince a court that the only way of achieving their goal of protecting people from election-related disinformation is through a law like this, a law that has this broad of a scope. And I think a potential plaintiff here easily convinced the court that this law is overbroad. One of the interesting aspects of it is I've seen a lot of deepfake images and audio that actually reflect well on the characters. So there's a lot of like parody Twitter accounts where Donald Trump is rescuing people from the rubble on September 11th.
Right.
Or doing other heroic things in history. Now, the California law says that this has to be done with malicious intent in order for it to be a violation under the law, but that can be very subjective and very difficult to enforce. All of this is to say that I'm not sure that this is sufficiently narrowly tailored. 120 days is a long time. There is a carve-out for both media organizations and for satire and parody. But then you get that fine line of what counts as satire and parody, what doesn't, who makes that determination. Are these going to get tied up in court? I just see this as being problematic. So I'm really not sure how this is going to go. If I had to guess, I think there'll be an injunction based on the fact that this isn't sufficiently narrowly tailored, and it would end up prohibiting a bunch of effective political speech that candidates or campaigns would like to use to try to define an opponent, but they would be unable to do so under these restrictions.
Okay, I have a few questions.
Yep, sorry, I was talking for a long time.
No, it's good. So is this the way this usually goes, where let's just call them the legislators in this case, because that's who they are, try to come in as broadly as possible with what they think could work, and then I'm thinking specifically in a free speech situation here, it gets narrowed down over time because it has to?
I think that's possible.
Yeah.
I think the legislators shoot their best shot here. They very clearly identified a problem. They had hearings on this bill where they talked about the role of deepfake videos and election-related misinformation. So they certainly did their homework here, and maybe they are expecting that this will be subject to judicial review. I mean, I think they were 100% positive that there was going to be a lawsuit on this. Elon Musk has been tweeting extensively about this law and has been blatantly violating it himself, I think as a way to show that he is willing to disobey this law to be the guinea pig that goes to court.
Oh, I see.
Although I'll note that among the first few people who filed a lawsuit, he is not one of them. So we'll see what actually happens. But yeah, I think it's possible that this could be whittled away in court, where maybe there are parts of the law that are acceptable. I think the part of the law that's applicable year-round, not limited to those 60 or 120 days, which requires disclosure, I don't think that is necessarily such an inhibition on free speech that it would be struck down. So that aspect might survive. But just this blanket ban on deepfake content with the malicious intention to deceive, I think is something that's going to run into a First Amendment sized boulder here. And it's going to be very difficult to uphold that restriction given what we know about First Amendment case law.
So just broadly, educate me here. If I'm running a campaign against my opponent, I'm running for city council, and the evil Ben Yellen is running against me, to what degree am I allowed to just spew horrible lies about Ben Yellen and have that be protected by free speech?
You have almost carte blanche. Basically, the standard there in terms of suing the media organization that prints or publishes that ad is they would have to have acted with actual malice, meaning they would have to know that what you were saying was a lie or have reckless disregard for the truth. And that gives media organizations certainly a lot of leeway. And some things are maybe not technically lies, but sort of fibs or intended to deceive, but it would be really difficult to prove in court that it was an actual lie. Like, such and such candidate has been terrible for the economy. That's not really a falsifiable statement. I mean, you could look at a million different statistics and come up with a million different conclusions. So, like, if I tried to sue you for defamation, I would almost certainly lose. You have pretty expansive free speech rights in terms of political content. And that's why this law is really unique, because basically what I'm telling you is you can lie to the extent that your pants are on fire,
right,
for the most part,
right,
if you do not use a deep fake or some form of artificial intelligence to alter images or audio. But if you do that with the intention to deceive, then you can be punished under the law.
So the notion here is, and I'm just being really basic on purpose. The notion here is that the technology itself is so perilous in its capability to deceive people that's the problem.
I think that's exactly right. With a lie, but something where you can attribute it to somebody. So a person watching that advertisement would know that it was you or your campaign that was spreading a lie. That gives a voter enough information to evaluate both candidates, really. They can do their own research and determine whether what you're saying is a lie, whether what you're saying is true. It's kind of par for the course for political campaigning. It's on the voters to make a decision based on that information.
Right.
With a deep fake, with an intention to deceive, it doesn't give voters accurate information. You are portraying something that a candidate supposedly said, which they didn't actually say.
Yeah.
So you can't properly evaluate it. whether that statement is a lie or the statement is the truth, because they didn't actually say it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, there's a big difference between, hey, did you see what Kamala Harris said about Donald Trump versus did you see what Donald Trump said, right? Like I saw him. I saw him say it. He said the words came out of his mouth. Let me show you the video. Look, here he is. He's saying it.
And they are increasingly convincing.
Same way in the other direction at her. Yeah. I mean, that you can understand and see how that could be so much more compelling, and not just to the unsophisticated viewer, right? There's sort of a visceral resonance that it has.
Yeah. One thing that's really getting at me is I think there is free speech value in making these types of deepfake videos, even if they are done for a deceptive purpose. Like, let's say you're trying to make a point about the Kamala Harris campaign. And I'll use my best friend Elon Musk as an example. He posts this video of Kamala Harris saying a bunch of things about herself that she never actually said. Like, I'm an empty suit. I was chosen because I was the diversity, equity, and inclusion candidate. You can agree with all of that or not, but it is like par for the course in political advertisement. There have been other satire videos where sometimes it's hard to tell if it's satire. It's just such a hard line to draw. And do we really want a court to make a determination as to what is properly defined as satire and what isn't? I don't think they're properly positioned to do that. I don't think a legislature is properly positioned to do that. So you end up in a situation where if this law is enforced, it's going to have a chilling effect on a lot of normal political speech, ways to attack the other candidate that can get under that candidate's skin or can relay a message to potential voters. And I just don't know if that's constitutionally acceptable. I think it's a really close call to me. Even though I recognize the danger of malicious deepfakes, I just foresee a situation where Elon Musk posts that video. Somebody, I guess it's the California Attorney General or it's Kamala Harris herself, file a lawsuit to get an injunction to get it taken down. And he says, this is political satire. I was doing it to make fun of Kamala Harris and her candidacy. I didn't do it with malicious intent. And how are we going to know whether what he's saying is accurate or not? I don't think there's a justiciable standard there, to be honest, like a real line where you would know whether something is or is not political satire. So in that sense, to me, it's going to be really hard to enforce.
What if I had a totally convincing celebrity impersonator? Let's say a radio ad, right? And I have somebody who absolutely sounds like Kamala Harris or absolutely sounds like Donald Trump. Is there a difference?
Under this law, that would be acceptable because that's not using synthetic media to create an audio or a video depicting somebody through the use of artificial intelligence. So at least under this law, it would not be covered.
So exact same message generated in different ways. One's legal, one isn't.
Yeah. I kind of think that's the case. You could use it. You can use an impersonator.
Right.
I don't want to be one of those Elon Musk style free speech absolutists. But if I were to argue as a Elon Musk style free speech absolutist, you would say in both of those circumstances, well, it's up to the Kamala Harris campaign to come back and say that's false, that's an impersonator, that's not me, or it's false, that's synthetic media, that's a deep fake. And you let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. I'm not saying that that's the right solution, but perhaps that's a better solution than going into court and having parties argue over whether something is satire, whether it was sufficiently labeled. I mean, all of those things just get really, really hard to discern once you get into a court proceeding. And I'm just not sure courts have the capability to do that, or whether it's their proper role in the first place.
Yeah. So you think we'll see an injunction pretty quick on this one?
I would suspect that we do see an injunction, especially on the first part of the law, which goes into effect immediately. That's applicable to this current election. So I do expect that some federal court will issue an injunction. One of the provisions in the law says that as it relates to California state courts, these proceedings have precedence over other legal proceedings because of the time-sensitive nature of the issue. So, yeah, I do think an injunction here is certainly within the realm of possibility. I would say more than 50% likely.
I'll just note also that rolled in with this bundle of bills that made their way through, one of the ones that Newsom signed was protecting actors from deepfakes in California, of course, being the home of Hollywood.
Right.
So
never want to get on the bad side of SAG-AFTRA.
That's right.
If you're the governor of California.
That's right. Exactly. So, yeah, interesting stuff. All right, we will have a link to that story in the show notes. That comes to us from the New York Times. My story this week is from the Federal Trade Commission, who published a report this week. And I'm going to point out that they're deliberately labeling this as a staff report. And this report finds that the large social media and video streaming companies have engaged in vast surveillance of users with lax privacy controls and inadequate safeguards for kids and teens.
Well, I never.
Well, so...
Knock me over with a feather, Dave.
So, yes, that is part of why I'm highlighting this story. I think most folks who follow this sort of thing would say, well, duh. So here's my question. Why this report? Why now? The people who've read this report, and I'll admit I haven't read the whole thing because it is extraordinarily dry. Like the commentary I've seen on this report says that, that it is just a boring, dry report. I think that's why they've labeled it as a staff report. I don't know if that's an excuse or a warning, right? That it's just going to be it lays out the facts, right? I mean, it says that none of this is surprising. But I'm curious for your take on this because I think a report like this is not without its utility.
I think it always carries some cachet to come from a government agency. It's one thing for a university or some other research entity to conduct a report and say this. They might generate some media coverage, but I think it has different meaning entirely when it comes from the Federal Trade Commission. Now, there's nothing enforceable here.
Right.
There's nothing from this report that says, therefore, we will issue civil or criminal penalties against these 5 companies on the basis of their actions. It's just, this is our view of what's happening. They were ordered to study this through a 2020 statute. And I'll also note that it was endorsed by all 5 members of the FTC, which you don't always see that. You see a lot of 3-2 decisions, particularly because the chair of the FTC, Lina Khan, who's kind of a controversial figure, mostly for her views on breaking up big tech companies, kind of being the antitrust voice in the room in all different realms. She's a little bit more controversial, and she and every other member of the commission endorsed this report. So, yeah, I think it carries more meaning coming from the FTC. The utility of it is certainly limited by the fact that they're explicit in that it's a staff report, meaning it's not something that came out of Lina Khan's office herself,
right,
or from one of the commissioners, which is fine. I mean, most reports are going to be staff reports. There are no actionable items that come from this report, but it could be a potential threat to these social media companies that says, we've established findings that might justify us in the future to take action.
Yeah.
So I certainly think in that sense it carries some significance.
So they have a number of recommendations here in the report, and this also is not surprising, but, I think it's another opinion on the pile, right? So the recommendations include, they say Congress should pass comprehensive privacy laws to limit surveillance and protect consumer data rights.
Yeah,
Duh.
I mean, we've been calling for that on this podcast for years. And if they're not going to listen to us, Dave, are they really going to listen to the staff members at the FTC?
Good point. They say companies should minimize data collection, adopt clearer privacy policies, limit data sharing, and delete unnecessary data. Okay?
Sure. Yeah.
They say sensitive information should not be collected through invasive tracking technologies. Yep.
Sounds good.
Yep. Stricter rules should apply to ad targeting and how user data is handled by automated systems.
Sounds good to me.
And special protections should be put in place for children and teens, recognizing their distinct needs and vulnerabilities.
We've seen that. I mean, Congress is trying to pass a couple of bills related to child online privacy. They passed nearly unanimously, I believe, in the Senate, but they're facing headwinds in the House of Representatives. So at least one of those recommendations is sort of already in progress. We'll see what happens prior to the end of the year.
I mean, this seems to me like a common sense wish list that be hard to argue against. Is this just something that the folks who are in Congress and are trying to push these things forward, like a comprehensive privacy bill, this is another thing that they can point to? They can say, look, we got a unanimous vote from the FTC supporting this point of view.
Yeah, it's fuel for those findings, and sometimes those findings can have legal significance. So let's say Congress drafts a comprehensive data privacy bill, and they include a list of legislative findings. And they among those legislative findings are the data and the recommendations included in this report. And eventually, this is subject to a legal challenge, and somebody's trying to determine if the government has a compelling interest in pursuing this action. The most compelling evidence, so to speak, might be something like this report. You put it in the legislative history, that's something that the parties and the judges could point to as, well, we have FTC staff findings that say X. That can be persuasive. Now, we're a few steps away from that happening. First, Congress actually has to pass something.
Right.
Never bet on it.
Yeah.
Never, ever bet on that.
Sure.
And second, we would have to see a legal challenge under those terms. And so we're a long way from getting to that point, but I do think something like this could be persuasive evidence in that type of proceeding.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the slow slog of building the foundation for maybe getting something in the future.
Yeah, we've seen that in other areas of the law, where sometimes it takes a bunch of official reports to change the public's consciousness. Think about smoking. You know, it took decades of Surgeon General reports and congressional hearings to really get the point across to people who were addicted to smoking and liked it, that smoking was really dangerous and was going to cause lung cancer. It started with these types of studies and findings, and it ended with bans on smoking in restaurants and hotels, or raising the age to buy cigarettes to 21, which Congress did recently. So sometimes it will end up leading to legislative action. It is part of that long, long slog. And I certainly think this is among the more compelling evidence because they did such a comprehensive study here, reaching out to the big tech companies. They received answers from 9 companies, Amazon, including Twitch, Meta, YouTube, the artists formerly known as Twitter, Snap, ByteDance, our old friends, the parent company to TikTok, Discord, Reddit, and WhatsApp.
Yeah. I was chuckling here because when you're talking about smoking, I remember having a conversation with my kids where they were like, you mean you could smoke anywhere? Like, people smoked at the mall? I was like, oh, yeah.
People used to smoke on airplanes.
Right,
That's the one that gets me. And
Yeah.
in my lifetime, I remember there were smoking sections on airplanes, which just seems bizarre. Like, you can't escape that secondhand smoke.
No. My favorite joke about that is having a smoking section in an airplane is like having a peeing section in a pool.
Exactly. Yep. Spreads the same way.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, with that, we will move on. We will have a link to that FTC report in the show notes. A warning, if you are dealing with insomnia, this report will be very helpful in getting you to have a good
Read
night's
it in lieu
sleep.
of the Ambien you were going to take tonight.
That's right. But perhaps I would recommend, if you're interested in it, find someone else who did the work and did reporting on it to find out what it's about. But at any rate, glad to see the FTC staffers fighting the good fight and doing this. All right, we will be right back after this message from our show sponsors. And now, a word from our sponsor, Cortex. Security teams face a barrage of more. More security tools create more complexity. More devices need protection. More specialized focus areas create more silos. The security landscape is changing fast. How can security operations transform to meet current threats? Cortex by Palo Alto Networks consolidates SecOps tools into an integrated platform and helps organizations stop threats at scale with AI, automation, and analytics. Learn more at paloaltonetworks.com/Cortex. Ben, I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Jen Roberts and Natansha Bansal. They are both assistant directors of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative from the Atlantic Council. They recently put out a report titled Mythical Beasts and Where to Find Them, mapping the global spyware market and its threats to national security and human rights. Here's our conversation.
I think that we have sort of seen from great reporting from Citizen Lab and Amnesty International, as well as plenty of others, the harms and abuses that have come out of the spyware industry. We've also seen from the EU, I believe it was last summer, maybe 2 summers ago. It's hard to keep track of time. The Pegasus Committee investigation that was taken underneath of the European Parliament. This project sort of came about by thinking about what spyware is and why it is being misused. And we sort of dove into this dual-use technology in the report and talked about both its harms for human rights, but also its benefits for national security. Something that we've noticed in the spyware industry in particular is there's just a lack of transparency into what is happening. We framed this approach as mapping the global spyware market because we really wanted to dive into the supply chain of what makes a spyware vendor. A lot of the time, the policy and research conversations have been at the vendor level, and we wanted to dive in more towards, okay, who are supplying these capabilities, who's investing in these capabilities, how do these vendors stand up and seem to dodge export controls and sanctions and the like. So that's where the project got its meat and bones from.
Everything that Jen said, but honestly, the reality is we were very intrigued by the weird names and the mythical names of the vendors and the spyware.
Well, Natansha, to that point, I mean, I think for me, when I think of spyware, I think I tend to think of the two extremes. There's the giant organizations, or maybe giant is the right word, the notorious organizations like NSO Group, like Intellexa, who make the headlines. But then I also think of the small apps that folks use to keep track on a spouse who they may feel is being unfaithful to them, or an abusive spouse trying to keep tabs on someone. Extreme ends of the spectrum. But one of the things that was really eye-opening to me from your report was just the breadth of companies that are out there in this business.
Yeah, that's honestly how we started thinking about this. And then you've hit on a very strong quad of this report. When you say like the big players like the NSO and then try to demarcate with the stalkerware, our report does spend a good chunk of time and energy into trying to define what a spyware is. So our specific report does not include stalkerware, which is what the other half of the spectrum is what you were mentioning. But our report primarily focuses on spyware, which is essentially the type of capability which does not require any interaction with the app or any interaction with the capability. And also the purpose is intrusion and surveillance. Now, when you talk about stalkerware, the purposes are different, but then with the spyware, it's the same. And then obviously, as the breadth, as you mentioned, there are big players and also small players. We also wanted to just make sure that we are able to talk about the entire market, which is why when you talk about, there are so many companies, yes, there are around 435 entities that we are seeing. The entities in our case include the vendors, their branches, their subsidiaries, and also the individuals. So something that was very intriguing to us was not just the companies, but also the individuals involved in this entire market.
Jen, I'm curious, I think we think about the current players here in this market, but there's quite a history here. I mean, this goes back, is it fair to say these sorts of things reach back decades?
Yeah, our report actually highlights the ecosystem from 1992 to 2023. Our oldest vendor observed is RCS Labs, based in Italy. We stopped the data set in the collection in 2023 because we didn't want to make an assumption that all of these vendors would be operational through 2024. I think that we have seen some disruption of activity. There was recent sanctions part 2 on the Intellexa consortium that came out from the US Treasury Department just this week. So we are trying to encapsulate not only that 30 years of history, but really stay apprised of in what years are we seeing activity in, both spike up and drop off. And that's something that's really cool that our project, particularly the interactive graphic, does, is it'll give you a year by year sort of snapshot of where this market is and how many actors or entities are involved, whether it be individuals, partners, holding companies, or the vendors themselves. So you can really customize this tool to, if you're a researcher or a policymaker, to be whatever you want it to be. You can sort by jurisdiction. You can sort by a different vendor. You can look at it where the investors are primarily based. You can see what the market looked like in 2020 versus 2023, depending on what your individual interests are and what you're trying to achieve. And the reason we built that much nuance into this is because there's a transparency issue in this market, and we wanted to just shed as much light as we could find in the open source and serve as sort of a one-stop shop data point for policymakers and researchers alike.
Natasha, you mentioned this is a dual-use technology. It can be used for both legitimate and abusive purposes. How are the governments around the world balancing these conflicting uses? And to what degree do they have success or failure in trying to reach that balance?
Oh, I think that balance is quite difficult, honestly. And this is something that we are hoping to achieve through our report because we feel that there's a misbalance in trying to just use and the misuse. So, something that we want the governments is to understand how the misuse is harmful for them as well as the entire world. And obviously, the industry that's been perpetuating because of the misuse is harmful to human rights and the national security, not just of their government, but otherwise. So, I think my take to your question would be that there is a misbalance, and I wouldn't say that the governments are doing a good job at creating a balance about this. But curious to see what Jen has thoughts about.
Yeah, but I will say that there has been, at least in the past year and a half, a lot more policy momentum behind this, both within the US and abroad. There's the Pall Mall process that's being led up by the UK and French governments. There's the joint statement spearheaded by the US government that seems to be expanding every year at Summit of Democracy. I know in 2024 in South Korea, they added a few more signatories, including some interesting names. Also, as I mentioned a little earlier, we saw a second part of the Treasury sanctions. So it seems to be both in the EU, UK, and US. There's a lot of policymaker attention on this, and it seems to be a torch that people want to carry forward into 2025, seeing how we can better shape this market and also eliminate the misuses to the best of our capability of these capabilities.
When we say misuse, what kinds of things are we talking about? I mean, you mentioned human rights abuses. I mean, is that that's easy to imagine, but what are the list of ways in which these are misused?
I think that our report doesn't necessarily get into the use cases of these capabilities as much, but I think that if listeners are interested in diving into how these capabilities have been used before in the past, there's some pretty excellent reporting from Citizen Lab and Amnesty Tech that they can check out, as well as the EU PEGA Committee's report on the use of Pegasus within the EU. You can sort of see the widespread use of these capabilities to suppress human rights in the various cases that they have been used to do so. So that's what we're really getting at with misuse. But Natasha?
Yeah, I think just a couple of examples could be about identity theft as well, and also impersonation, along with just absolute, just like the privacy is in big question. We've also seen real life impact of spyware on human life in areas like Saudi Arabia and everything. And I think these are some of the ways in which spyware is misused. But as Jen mentioned, there's like a reporting which primarily focuses on the misuse of spyware.
Well, the report has some policy recommendations. Can we go through those together? What are the things that you all recommend here?
Yeah, so we propose 6 different policy recommendations. The first being mandate know your vendor requirements. The second being improving government run corporate registries. The third being enrich, audit, and publish export licenses. The fourth being limit jurisdictional arbitrage by vendors. And then the fifth being protect against SLAP. I think that I might have said 6 before, but I meant 5. We talked about the SLAP lawsuits. I just brought it up. I know that we talked a little bit about corporate registry, so I would like to really dig into particularly our know your vendor requirements. This is a recommendation that we also released in an earlier report, I believe in 2021, where we believe that the United States and its partners should enforce know your vendor requirements. That spyware vendors essentially disclose supplier and investor relationships. So something that we really wanted to get out of this report, and I mentioned at the top, was it's not a very, very transparent market. And what this data set and what this report tries to do is shed transparency into the market. Part of that transparency are these supplier and vendor and investor relationships. This recommendation sort of gets to the core of some of the issue that governments who want to buy responsibly and are trying to put safeguards on buying responsibly from vendors who are not known to sell to governments that misuse these capabilities. They need to know further down the supply chain if there are other relationships that vendor has that might be on a list. So it's pretty obvious for the US to not do business with NSO Group, but say it's a new vendor that they don't necessarily know that much of, but they one of the investors is also an investor in NSO Group. That might not want to win a US government contract. So what the Know Your Vendor recommendation is trying to do is expose more light into the supply chain of where are these vulnerabilities coming from? Where are these exploits coming from? Who is investing in who? Are there any individuals that are on an entity list somewhere to give governments who want to buy responsibly more due diligence into the process? And then another recommendation that I think that we could dive in a little bit more, Natasha, is jurisdictional arbitrage, if that's something you want to talk about, or if, Dave, there's anything in particular of the recommendation side that you thought was interesting and you want us to talk about.
No, Natasha, go ahead.
Yeah. The next one that we can talk about is the jurisdictional arbitrage. So the first thing I want to highlight is that all of our policy recommendations came out once we saw some trends. There are 6 trends in the report that we talk about. And the trend that we saw was the concentration and also jurisdictional hopping by vendors as well as their different entities. So something that we saw is that these entities and these vendors change their identities very frequently to prevent from coming into the radar of the government and regulations, and also that they hop from one jurisdiction to another. The best guess and probably the obvious guess is to make sure that they go from stricter jurisdictional or stricter regulations to more lenient regulations, which is how we came around our recommendation 3 and 4, which we talk about export licenses and also limiting jurisdictional arbitrage. So what this essentially talks about is that there are several countries which have the policy of imposing export licensing and also restricting export licensing. But what is the tricky part here is that there is very few countries have an audit system for these export licenses, and even lesser number of them publish these export licenses. So what our report is proposing is that make it a stronger process so that these are not used unless And these are not used for like nefarious purposes. And also the other one is that to prevent jurisdictional arbitrage for the business, jurisdictional arbitrage is essentially a vendor taking advantage of the difference in the jurisdiction, a difference in the rules and regulations from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. So what we're seeing in areas within like EU as well, as a block, that we see a lot of hopping from one country to another country. And what we are proposing is that specifically for vendors which have export licenses, there should be stricter rules which can help in preventing this hopping and then just bringing in more transparency. So something like opening a new subsidiary or closing a subsidiary or changing a name or opening a new branch should have implications or should be reported directly to the agencies, like the law enforcement agencies, so that there is an understanding that if a vendor hops from Italy to, say, another country, the other country already has that background knowledge and they can already like pinpoint that, oh, this is a doubtful vendor and we need to take care of them.
And I can hop in with a specific example here of what Natasha's talking about with jurisdiction hopping. We observed in 2017, the vendor Quadream established a subsidiary in Reach, particularly in Cyprus, and they had a later court case where they were talking about this, and they said that the reason that they even established InReach, quote, was to, quote, sole purpose of promoting Quadream Inc. products within the European Union, and end quote. So what that sort of shows there is this direct sort of establishment of business practices to circumvent export controls, establishing an entity within the European market to sell to the European market sort of gets away from the export controls that were placed on Israel by the EU.
It's really interesting. I mean, before we wrap up here, I'm curious, what is your sense for the amount of political will there is around the world to put any sort of controls on this kind of thing? I mean, I can imagine there are nations who consider this to be part of what they need for the espionage they want to do. What's your sense with that?
I can take this up and then
okay, Natasha.
Yeah. No, I am happy that we will be able to close this on an optimistic note, honestly, Dave. I think there's a strong will. We've seen strong will both in the US and the EU, as Jen mentioned at some point in our session today. We're seeing a lot of work already being done. And we've, in our briefings as well, we are seeing a lot of interest in just understanding this market better, and also a lot of interest from the government coming into taking our policy recommendations and then sitting down and listening as to why these policy recommendations are important. But obviously, when we talk about the world, different nations, given their different priorities, we would talk like differently about their priorities. But certainly in like the regions which are like significantly coming out in our report, we do see a lot of strong political will out here.
I would also add that for the political will, I think that there's an effort to preserve these capabilities for this direct purpose. I think that's why there's so many conversations about this. And the conversation is gearing more, how do we buy more responsibly? How do we shape this market? How do we minimize misuse? It's not going the policy conversations that are happening, at least with the Pall Mall process and the like, are not necessarily going in the direction of we need to get rid of these capabilities because of their purposes, like you said, for especially states that don't have homegrown offensive cyber capabilities. There's a reason why this market is so large. There's a reason why this market is so profitable. It's because states want these capabilities. And I think there's an entire flip side of this coin that is not as heavily reported on, which is the use of these capabilities for national security purposes. So I think that, to Natasha's point, and an optimistic point, is that the conversation is shaping more towards shaping the market and limiting misuse and combating proliferation than it is from cutting off these states from having these capabilities at all.
Ben, what do you think?
Really interesting. I mean, I just think I wasn't aware of the extent of this network.
Yeah.
435 entities in the global spyware market.
Right.
So you get a bunch of different vendors, suppliers, subsidiaries, countries.
Yeah.
So I have to say I was sort of ignorant on the size and scope of these spyware markets.
Yeah.
So it's really useful information.
Yeah, me too. I think we think of the top 2 or 3 that get all the headlines, the big ones, the Pegasus, things like that. But it really is a web of these sorts of things.
It's all part of the ecosystem.
Yeah. And this report really lays it all out, along with having some good recommendations there, too. So, again, the report is titled Mythical Beasts and Where to Find Them, Mapping the Global Spyware Market and Its Threats to National Security and Human Rights. Our thanks to Jen Roberts and Natansha Bansal from the Atlantic Council for joining us. The IT world used to be simpler. You only had to secure and manage environments that you controlled. Then came new technologies and new ways to work. Now, employees, apps, and networks are everywhere. This means poor visibility, security gaps, and added risk. That's why Cloudflare created the first-ever connectivity cloud. Visit cloudflare.com to protect your business everywhere you do business. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to caveat@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K makes it easy for companies to optimize your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your teams while making your teams smarter. Learn how at n2k.com. This episode is produced by Liz Stokes. Our executive producer is Jennifer Eiben. The show is mixed by Trey Hester. Our executive editor is Brandon Karpf. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. I'm Dave Bittner.
I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.